you here for the reunion? I said, yes. And we sat and talked. Well, that was Karen Kunkel. Karen Kunkel had been a ball player with the All-Americans, but she had also been an advisor for Penny Marshall on the movie A League of Their Own. Karen, you know, has passed away a few years ago, but Karen was just this very boisterous and full of life. And she encouraged me, you know, go take a nap and whatever, come back down, everybody will be very generous. So I did that. And I came back into the hotel lobby and I was met with a sea of old gray-haired women. And I've had this gray hair since I was about 30. So I fit right in, even though, you know, they're looking at me like, whatever. So I'm standing there looking around thinking, what is going on? And all these women are talking. And all of a sudden this woman walks up to me, just very frantic. Have you seen Jane? And I said, I don't know Jane. And before I could really complete that sentence, she said, oh, holy cow, there she is over there. And she takes off across the lobby, first though, handing me her suitcase so that I'm carrying her suitcase, following her across the hotel lobby. So we walk up to this woman who obviously I don't know either. And that's Jane Moffitt, who is vice president of the All-American Players Association. Jane didn't even look at me. She looked at Lefty, that woman was Lefty. She looked at Lefty and she said, who's this? And Lefty said, I don't know. But she had a nice face and I thought she could carry my luggage. And so I'm sitting there thinking, and I'm old enough to remember Candid Camera. So I'm standing there going, what is going on? You know, is there a camera someplace? And the two of them are kind of going back and forth. I'm still holding Lefty's luggage. And this woman, this other woman comes up behind me and says, I don't know, Jane. She does look like she has a nice face and she's got a funny name. And I turn around and literally look into the chest of Erlene Beans Reisinger, who was well over 6 feet tall. And she started calling me Kit Kat. And I was Kit Kat until she passed away in 2008. And she said, they talked a little bit more. And again, I stood there completely just stunned by what was happening. And so finally Beans said to Jane, I don't know, Jane, yeah, she does seem pretty nice. I think she could carry your luggage too. And so the three of them took off with me in tow, carrying Jane's and Lefty's luggage. And, it went downhill from there. I've been carrying their luggage, both literally and figuratively, since 2003. And you know, one of the reasons I tell that story, first of all, it was hysterical in hindsight, but it was all Lefty. She just picked me out of a crowd. It could have been any one of you, but that was the trusting, open, loving nature of Isabel Lefty Alvarez. We became friends first. And in terms of how did I get into this story, the more and more we talked, the more that we became friends, because she was very hesitant about opening up about her life in Cuba, at least at first. The more that we talked and the more stories she told me, I realized this is, my God, this is the baseball story, right? And she was resistant. She said, no, I'm not the best player. You need to write a book about Kamenchek or somebody who was a much better ball player, and I wasn't an all-star and all those things. I said, no, you know what? There are a lot of books about those women and we know those things. What we need to hear more of are stories like yours. And that is about the importance of baseball in the lives of people and specifically women. And I have, for some reason, always had a love and appreciation for Cuba, the culture, the baseball, all of it. And I don't know why. I don't have necessarily a personal connection, but so this became this perfect way that these things fit together for me. And so when I finally convinced Lefty to let me write her book, we became even closer because the stories that are in the book about her life poured out of her in some very painful ways. And I hope that I've done them justice in the book, because it was tough to listen to some of those stories from a woman that I had grown to love and admire, because they were very painful. So it evolved over time is the short answer, but it's any one of you that have met any of these women from the All-Americans will know what I'm saying is true, is that they are open and gracious and And she was certainly that.
We talked a little bit before we started this session here, just about kind of the duality of the book. That is her life during baseball and her life after baseball. Do you think that she has a sense of how she's compartmentalizing her life?
That's something that I'm not sure she did have a sense of that when it was happening. And I think that's true for a lot of us. We look back on situations in our lives and we realize that, oh, yeah, I see what I was doing. But as you and I talked about, one of the methods that I use in all of my work, one of the theories that I use a lot is that of intersectionality. And from that idea, from that concept, I created something that I call sport identity. And I used it in an article published in 2012 in the International Journal of Sports History, and then in my first book. And certainly Lefty is a perfect example of that. So it's that, we're all multifaceted. We all have different elements to our identities, but for some of us, sport is an identity marker. And so Lefty is an example of that. And she calls it her sport self. And in the book, I use that phrase interchangeably with sport identity, because those are Lefty's words. I think ultimately she realized that she needed that sport self in order to survive some of the things that she ultimately survived. But I don't know that she would have said, okay, there's the before baseball and the after baseball. But there's a way that you just, it just becomes part of how you cope. And I think that was true for Lefty. And ultimately in our conversations, I think she did come to that realization. Oh yeah, it's because of my sports self. And so thank God it was there, because I think she relied on it and it literally, I think at times saved her life.
You mentioned the word coping, and it seems like, throughout her childhood, growing up, and the way she did with her parents and her brother, she found ways to cope, and sports was a coping mechanism.
That's right.
Whether she's fencing or playing soccer or volleyball or baseball,
But
she's finding that outlets. What any insights on kind of how she shared that?
well, she Lefty is even today sometimes, well, when I say today, I don't mean, I haven't had conversations with Lefty now in a few years, mostly because of the dementia. But in those latter years that I talked to her, she was sometimes hard to really understand. It's like her ideas kind of came out in pieces and parts. And so that's some of what you're going to get, right? Is that, but if I talk to her about this idea about, what did sports mean to you? I mean, some of it was holy cow, it meant everything. What do you think it meant? I wouldn't be here if it wasn't. I mean, so there was this sort of almost gut level, why are you even asking me that? And yet one of the ways that she would get to that would be telling in this sort of this roundabout way, telling this story about something her mother made her do. The best example of that is the beauty pageant. Lefty was and still is absolutely gorgeous. The pictures of her as a young woman, she is stunning. And her mother was desperate to find something, find a way for Lefty to get out of the situation they were in. And she entered her into a beauty pageant without even really talking to Lefty about it. And that was so not Lefty. There was, physical looks, obviously, but not who she was. And so in telling that story to me, one of the things she said was, that's just not me. I didn't want to wear those dresses and look pretty and have people look at me. I wanted to be out playing ball. I mean, that's what I needed. And so what I did, I would get all dressed up and I would go do those things my mother wanted me to do. And then I go play ball. And so she didn't identify it as, okay, here's a way to, there's a way that she felt like she couldn't say it outright. You know, she couldn't say outright, this is what I'm calling this. But through the stories, it's very much, it's a very important element to her story. She just didn't have the language really.
Right. Well, you know, it occurred to me that let's just talk about her stories. So give us a
Okay.
little bit of a kind of a background on Lefty growing up in Cuba and playing sports and how she gets into baseball and so on.
Yep. Okay. Well, you know, as anyone who really reads about or studies baseball in Cuba, or even if you just barely know about it, you know that Cubans love baseball. It is referred to as the passion of the island in places. And Lefty's mother was a big baseball fan. Lefty loved to play it. Her story about getting into baseball, playing baseball, and I don't mean organized baseball necessarily, but just playing it on the streets. Her stories about that are very similar to the stories of many of the other women from the All-Americans, or many of the women who are probably looking at this right now who played baseball on the streets with their brothers or the boys down the street. That's how Lefty started playing. Mm-hmm. And it was, again, her mother who said, you know, there's this guy who's putting together a team. Let's get you on it. You know, let's see if we can't get you out there. You're a good ball player. But it started like so many other girls and boys, but particularly girls, because there wasn't an organized way of playing. It started with her playing in the streets. They didn't have a ball. They didn't have bats. They certainly didn't have gloves. What she did talk about was how they would use strips of old cigarette packets and mold them into a ball. And so, you know, she got into the game like many, many other people. In terms of playing for the Cubanas, that was her mother. Her mother got in touch with, or they got in touch with her, the folks who were putting the team together. And so Lefty tried out basically because her mother said she should. And she was only about 14. So she was good. And it was De Leon who ultimately gave her her first glove. And she started to play in an organized league then for the first time. And Lefty was one of these people that baseball was, as a fan, baseball was very important to her and to her mother. It was also important to her brother, who was also a pretty good baseball player. She tells a story about, they lived in El Cerro, which is in very near the stadium in Havana. And she tells a story about her mother would be listening to the ball game on the radio, and then they would open the windows because they could hear the fans cheering at the stadium while they were listening to the ball game. Her mother would light a candle for her team. I mean, these are serious baseball fans, right?
Right.
So, so she got it honest, as they say. But she played with the Cubanas. She played in 1947 when the All-Americans went to Havana for spring training. She was part of that. So it was, her story about getting into the game was really not all that different than what most of us would think or have probably heard about some of the other All-Americans. It just happened to be in Cuba.
What was her relationship like at that point with some of the other young women on the team?
Are some of the women from Cuba or from the
the other Cubanas?
Right.
I mean, because they kind of become her support.
They do. In that first year in 47, she didn't really. She didn't have what I would call a strong relationship with any of the other players. In part because she was so young.
Right.
I think, and also because her mother was very protective. So she played on the team, but she was kind of kept away from some of the older girls. They became closer when they came to the U.S. because she really relied on them to help her make that transition. So she didn't have much of a relationship with those women early on, but she did certainly as once they both all came to the U.S.
And prior to that, I know they did a little bit of traveling. I think one of the photos you have in the book is of her playing a game in Venezuela.
Yes, yes. There were the All-Americans actually did a couple of different Latin American tours.
Hmm.
When Philip Wrigley sold the league to Meyerhoff, his advertising executive, Meyerhoff understood that in order for the league to survive, there needed to be more players. They needed to expand, and he, of course, was smart enough to know that baseball was extremely important in Latin America. So he put together a Latin American tour. And Lefty tells some stories about dancing with President Somoza in the palace, and about traveling to all of these countries that, of course, she felt more comfortable because she could understand the language. She did not speak much English at all. So she was part of that tour. And I think she got to know a few of the American players at that point that she reconnected with when she went to the US.
Well, that's great. So set the scene for us as she's leaving Cuba and she's arriving in the U.S. I believe her first stop is with the Chicago Colleens.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. She talks about leaving Cuba, and that was she was 15 and she didn't speak English. I'm not a parent, but I can't imagine putting my kid on a plane when they're 15 to go to
Right.
a country where they don't speak the language. And so I was curious to know, how did your mother react? How did you react? And she said, I don't really know. I didn't look back. My mother said, get on the plane. So I got on the plane. So she got on the plane with her suitcase and a glove. And, she said, I never even looked back to see what my mother was doing or saying, but it was her mother who wanted that for her. And she was determined to do it and do it proudly. She said when she first got to Chicago, obviously the first thing was that she had never owned a coat. And so her host family met her and gave her a coat. And that was still just one of the most amazing memories to her, that there are these people who didn't know her, and they were very excited to welcome her. And I think she was just overwhelmed, I mean, in the way that someone who's from a small town might be the first time they go to New York City, for example, or something like that. I mean, so there was the language barrier. It was really very, very difficult. And I think she went through some very difficult times, but having those other Cuban players there certainly helped. But it was a challenge, to say the least.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, we just talked about, support, where do you
Yeah,
look for support?
right,
And then how do
right.
you, even with the host families, how do you find, how do you establish that relationship? And it sounds like she's got, with later on with, I think, it might have been Fort Wayne, with the folks she stayed
Yes.
with in Fort Wayne, that she had just quite the relationship with.
Yes, and still and still does. That was the Blee family.
Hmm.
They were so instrumental, and in fact, Nancy Blee is quoted a great deal in the book because she was gracious enough that she brought Lefty and me several years ago to her home in California, and the three of us sat and talked, and they told stories about the time that, as Nancy says, Lefty marched us into the middle of the revolution in Havana, and they think of themselves as sisters, and so that relationship with that family was extremely important to Lefty's survival,
Hmm.
it continues to be. Writing this book was a 10-year at times labor of love, and at times, difficult, and all that is wrapped up in writing a book. But I got an email from Nancy Blee. It was probably last week, I guess, that said to me, I cannot thank you for helping the world know about my sister, Isabel. She calls her Isabel. And in this email, it was very clear to me that that family connection, and that's the way they think of it, that family connection is still very real for the Blee family. So Lefty was very, very lucky because they kept her out of trouble.
Oh,
A lot.
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so, we talked a bit about kind of how Lefty kind of saw herself. And I just wonder, so you talk about Nancy Blee, I'm wondering, were there opportunities where Nancy got to, or where Lefty got to hear Nancy talk about her? And did
Yes.
that give her some like reflection, like, oh, I didn't know you saw me that way, or,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. In fact, in that one particular visit where the three of us were together for several hours, and it gave both of them an opportunity to do that, which was really wonderful to see. And when Nancy talked about, at those sessions, when Nancy talked about Lefty as her sister, and how it was important that the world knows, and this was in the language that Nancy used, that the world knows the true loving, caring heart of Isabel. And Lefty started to cry, and she said, this was the best thing, the second best thing about coming to this country to play ball, is being part of the Blee family. And I said, well, what was the first? And she said, well, I became an American citizen.
Oh.
And it was the Blee family who made that happen, who helped make that happen. So there are, and she was then able to say to Nancy, this is, and for the first time, that this was an extremely important piece of my life, and that would not have happened had it not been for your family. And so it was, I think, a pretty important reconciliation, only in that they had not really been in each other's lives for a while.
Gotcha. Let's see. So we've got a couple of questions here. So let me just start off with here. Let's see. Did Lefty, this is from our friend Perry Barber, did Lefty have her own individual host family? Was she deliberately, quote, segregated from the American Canadian players housing wise?
Thank you, Perry. I'm glad you didn't ask what kind of cereal she eats in the morning. So, she did threaten that, by the way. That's a great question. She did not. Now, the Blees, for example, became a host family like a couple of years into her playing career. It was not a situation where, okay, the Cuban players need to go with certain families. Now, it is my understanding that the league did everything they could to match people. And the Blee family had taken in exchange students prior to Lefty being there. So they had experience with folks from other cultures, from other countries. And so I think that's one of the reasons they ultimately, she ultimately stayed with them. Although it was by accident initially that she and Nancy met, but the league had to approve that. They were not segregated in that way. I think it was more about where what was available in that town where they were playing. And some towns were going to have a little more option, or a few more options than others.
Gotcha. Let's see. Next question from Joshua Burstein. How, if at all, has the reaction to your book differed between academics and mainstream baseball fans? He says, great research, by the way.
Thank you. That's I appreciate you asking that question. As all of us know who are in academia and do work in sport history, I'll just say in general sport history, and specifically baseball history, that is a challenge because I am an academic. I think about things in certain ways. It's like my concept of sport identity. That is not necessarily something that's going to be of interest to a more general audience. They want to know about Lefty. They want to know about, so it was a challenge to sort of do that in a way that I could do both. I have I've been very fortunate that the reviews I've gotten, the feedback I've gotten have been pretty widespread. And no one has said, it's not academic enough or it's too academic. I mean, it's been, and I think in part, not because of me, but because who Lefty is, it's because of that story. So, and thank you for asking that question, because it's important for us. It's important for us to understand as both baseball fans, people who read books about baseball, but also those of us who are academics. It's important to understand those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but unfortunately, sometimes we're put into a we're into a pigeonhole. Hopefully, it will continue to get good feedback from both of those groups.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Speaking of academics, we've got Dr. Jorge Eber, who asks, let's see, where did he go? Kat, give us a sense of how typical was Lefty's experiences were compared to the other Cubanos who played in the league?
Good question. And I can speak to that only to a degree, because I have some knowledge of the other women, but unfortunately I don't have a lot. And much of this comes through Lefty's eyes, right? So this is through her perspective. I think because she was so young, she had a couple of things that made her experience a little different. She was very young. She was younger than the other women. And therefore, when they came to the US, a couple of them particularly, Lefty called them wild. They were wild girls, and they like to sneak out at night. They like to sneak some beer. They like to go visit men, that kind of thing. And Lefty, of course, is still a little kid. So, and a little kid in age, but also, immature as well. So I think her experience was different in large part because of that. It was also different, and this is sort of moving forward a little bit. It was also different because she stayed. She stayed in the U.S. She, in fact, all of the ball players who came from, whether it was Canada or Cuba, their contract required that they go back home, wherever home was. They go back home in the off season, and then their contract was their ticket back home, for example. So she really didn't want to go back to Cuba in the off season. She wanted to stay in the U.S. And so I think that it became different. Her experience ultimately was different because she wanted to be here and made that happen, made that a priority. And then the last thing I would say about that is Lefty's experience in just about any way you want to look at it would be different because of her mother. Her mother was a driving force. Now, sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, but her mother was a driving force, and Lefty felt very sort of closed in. My mother wants me to do this, or my mother wants me to do that. And so I think everything was clouded. It was clouded a little bit by what her mother wanted or didn't want. I do not have much information about the other women, just, very basic. So, and I wish I did. And I would love it if somebody did a bigger project on the Cuban women who came to play.
Well, speaking of whom, our next question comes from Emily Nelson. I know she's been working on some aspect of this. So she's asking, we're talking about segregation a little bit ago, but since the AAGPBL didn't allow Black women to play in the league, was there any commentary or anything in your research that you discovered that spoke to the league only selecting light-skinned Cubanas for the league?
Well, nothing that overt. I have not come across anything that said, oh, well, we can have these Cuban women, but let's make sure they're, you know, they're light skinned. But then they also didn't say, we can't have Black women play.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's not going to be quite that open about it. So I don't have any evidence that they made that kind of decision. So I really don't know how to answer that. I know that in terms of segregation, they were definitely segregated. Now, this is one of the things that when I first met a lot of the women from the All-Americans, and I got to know them a little bit, and I started asking questions, and I would ask, well, were there any Black women who played? And almost to a woman, they said to me, oh, well, they just didn't try out. Well, you know,
Yeah, right.
I get what you're telling me, but
Yeah.
that's not right.
Right.
That's not right.
Right.
So my guess is that there were understandings about who could be part of the league and who couldn't.
Right. There's that, you know, a scene in the A League of Their Own where a ball's hit and an African American woman picks up the ball and just fires it back at the Gina Davis character,
Great
as
scene.
if as if to nod, like, "Yep, absolutely. I wish you were here on the field with us."
Yeah, yeah. And I think, what is that scene? Maybe 30 seconds, if that.
Yeah,
But I think it is,
exactly.
yeah,
Just
I think it is
powerful.
one of
Just
the most powerful. Yeah. And
absolutely.
that's the brilliance of Penny Marshall.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, it's back to our questions. Debbie is asking, did Lefty have any particular teammates or associates who helped her with dealing with a new culture and any prejudice she faced?
Yeah, in fact, thanks, Deb, for asking that. Jane Moffat, the woman that I mentioned early in that story, Jane Moffat was a very dear, close friend to Lefty and really took Lefty under her wing. In fact, Lefty kind of jokingly, you know, throughout the years, referred to Jane as her counselor. And, you know, Jane was like, nobody wants that. But she really, she had close friends. She had a number of close friends. But when sort of push came to shove, there were a few people, and that's, like, I think true for most of us, right? That when you get to a place in your life where, you know, whether it's end of life or whether it's a situation where you really need people, there are those few friends that come to the surface, and certainly Jane was one. Maybelle Blair is another one. Maybelle is, in fact, largely responsible for this book. And so there were a few women, in Dottie Collins, who has passed away a few years ago, was a very dear friend of Lefty's. And again, they were all very protective of one another and supportive of one another throughout the years. So I think, you know, we could probably list, you know, create a list as long as our arm of the women in the league, particularly, and not to mention associates like us who have, you know, certainly she has relied on. So yeah, there were a lot of them, and they all picked one another up, you know, and they still do.
That's great. Let's see, our friend Kit Krieger is asking, are there any veterans of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League still residing in Cuba?
No, not that I'm aware of. And again, this comes down to having some trouble finding some of the contacts for the other women that played.
Sure.
And so if it is my understanding that there is not, but there may be, and I just have not found that connection. I have reached out to a number of folks who I thought might know. Last November, I was very fortunate to go to Cuba. I was there with doing a paper about Lefty, and I reached out to some folks when I was there, just on the off chance that, you know, someone might know. So it's my understanding that there isn't.
Gotcha. Well, you know,
Sadly.
along that same line, Perry Barber is also asking here, how was Lefty regarded back in Cuba once she started playing in the U.S.? Did she
Was
get
a
any press back home, good or bad? And was she well known because she played here? Did she become
well,
famous or celebrated in Cuba? Sorry,
yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm chomping at the bit to talk about this. It's really
Yeah, go,
exciting.
go, go, go.
Well, the thing is, I don't know about press, right? But she was a superstar, right? Like, so she would come back home in the off season, and she tells a story about her mother. Lefty was not allowed like beyond the edge of their property, which was the house where they lived was very kind of right on the road, but she was not allowed to go beyond the sidewalk, for example. And so people would come by and just talk to her and see her, and oh, Lefty, well, Isabel, she was in America and she was playing ball, and they were all excited. And I mean, this was a big deal. This was a big deal to this community. It was a big deal to her family. And so there's that. But then the other thing, and this is one of the things that's so exciting. When I was there in November, I was fortunate enough to go to a ball game at the stadium, and the woman who was helping us, get around, and our driver and some other folks, I had Lefty's address where she lived, just about a block from the stadium. We went down the street to find this house, and she had described it to me, a million times. So we went down the street, and we pulled up to this corner where it was supposed to be, and like, that doesn't quite look right. And then there was this parking lot, and I thought, oh no, maybe they've torn it down. And this woman came out of this house speaking Spanish to our driver, and ultimately then what she was asking, are you looking for the house of the baseball player? And so she said, yes, we are, Isabel. And the woman who lived there said, this was the home of Isabel Alvarez. This was last November. And
Wow.
so I have pictures of myself with this big beaming smile in front of Lefty's house. This is, and you walk down the street, and these are incredibly gracious and kind and open people. And this woman was just, oh, well, come in. And, so today people know Isabel Lefty Alvarez. And the really cool thing that I hope is going to come out of this, and we're working on this right now, the man who is I think he's considered the president of the Baseball Federation.
Mm-hmm.
I may have the title wrong. At the stadium, when you go in, there's a small sort of museum. There are some murals or some statues and things of Cuban baseball players. He, through some other folks, and I have entered into a conversation about putting a bust of Lefty in that museum there at Havana Stadium. So,
Cool.
So I think that's the best way to answer that question. That even today, in what then 2019, they know who she is, and they are very excited, and they are they're very proud.
Yeah, and what a wonderful legacy that is
Oh
as
my
well.
God. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
couple of more questions here
Sure.
from Jorge. You presented a very positive view of other players and their relationships with Lefty. Were there any other who were not happy or resisted to having Cubanas on their team? If so, how did she deal with this situation? So it sounds
There
like a little bit of
was.
prejudice, bigoted.
Absolutely there was. And I don't want to misrepresent and say it was all Pollyanna, everybody was loving
Mm-hmm.
one another and kumbaya. That's not real.
Right.
But from Lefty's perspective, in fact, there are a number of examples of her being what I would call hazing now, right? We would call it hazing. And pranks pulled on her. That, to me, when she told me the stories, that kind of took my breath away. It seemed really mean to me, and I would not have dealt well with that myself. So I think there were women in the league who were not as friendly, not as welcoming to women of different cultures. And let's face it, we talk a lot about race and ethnicity and skin color, and however you want to describe it, and they would not have described it this way then. but Lefty was a woman of color in today's terms.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, there were players who wanted nothing to do with her or any of the other Cuban players. And certainly there were some of the tricks that were pulled on her, I found really, she did not identify it this way. So I want to be clear, this is my interpretation, not Lefty's. They seemed to me to be pretty cruel. And, but for her, it was like, oh, you know, they loved me or they wouldn't have done this. And so there's nothing that I found that was, again, just this overt racism. You know, we don't want you because you're Cuban.
Gotcha.
But, and again, now remember, this is pre-Castro, because I can tell you that many of those women, in talking about the post-Castro Cuba, would probably not have been as welcoming, sadly.
Yeah. Right. You know, the next actually is a statement. I'm going to ask Kit to unmute and explain what you were saying, Kit. Kit and Kat. That's funny. Hey, Kit, can you unmute? Kit. All right, so I'll just read it then. So Kit says a group that includes a few SABR members has worked to reestablish the Cuban Baseball Hall of Fame, which dates back to 1939. Okay, there you are, Kit. Go ahead and take over. Kit. Okay. Kit says he'll contact them and promote Lefty's induction into the Hall of Fame. He says, I'd like to know whether Kat has met with Sigfredo Barros in Havana. Sigfredo is a journalist and one of the key figures that worked to reestablish the Hall of Fame.
I have not worked directly, but the name was certainly mentioned to me, and I would love any help. I would love to have a conversation about this, because it's difficult. I don't speak Spanish, and so I am kind of at a a disadvantage. So I would love any kind of conversation we can have about that. I think that would be fantastic.
Great. I'll make the connection between you two as well.
Thank you.
And I want to go back to a earlier question from Ryan Schurer, who asks, how does the concept of sports identity apply to fans, in your humble opinion?
Oh, very good question. Well, sport identity is, I think it's not necessarily about someone who's a good athlete. I don't think it's necessarily about someone who actively plays baseball or tennis or anything else. I think it is about the importance of the sport. And so that could be a fan, right? That could be an umpire. That could be a manager. I mean, we all, we identify, some of us, with sport in different ways. And so I think as a fan, and I am mostly now, other than the work I do, I am mostly a fan. I don't, after several knee operations and various things, I don't play anymore. But as a fan, my connection to sport is every bit as real and every bit as important to my personal identity as it was when I played the game. So that's a really good question, and I think it's important to understand this broad concept of sport identity. It's not about who's the best athlete. Lefty was not the best athlete. Lefty was not the best ball player. And, and for a long time, she did not want me to write her book. She said, no, that you need to write a book about other people. Well, okay. But this idea of sport identity and the way that we brought this back to her life made sense to her ultimately. I really think it is something that can be applied, again, whether it's fans, umpires, managers, hell, I think you could probably even do it to the ticket takers, because these people are the game is part of who they are.
Right. So Deb is asking, what was Lefty's favorite thing about playing baseball?
Well, I don't know that I ever ask that specific question, but I think I would have to say it was the other players. You know, she was a good ball player. She wasn't a great ball player, but she loved the game and loved to play. But ultimately, it was about the community she created, and the family she created out of that opportunity.
Cool. Excellent. So what's next? How do you go about, I guess what was your experience like with the book, you know, getting the book published, and do you go on the road? Well, I guess after COVID, I mean, how do you go about promoting the book?
Well, let me just say, first of all, the experience of publishing the book, Nebraska Press, University of Nebraska Press was fantastic. Those folks were really, they were wonderful. And they snagged it right away, and they were wonderful to work with. You know, I would just give this advice to anyone who is thinking of writing a book. Do not plan to roll it out in the middle of a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah,
It's
good
really
advice.
not the time to do it. So, you know, it's hard because, you know, you plan talks and book signings and things like that. And we obviously can't do that. So we do these kinds of things. And this has been fantastic. I do have a couple of things that are in the works, some things that I'm hoping will be pretty exciting events coming up with some other folks. But you know, right now I'm just doing what I can in this way. I'm trying to keep the book out there on social media, and thank you. And so that's about all I can do at this point. I've already sort of, while I'm focused on marketing this book and getting it out there, I'm also working on or thinking about my next project. So, you know, it never ends, right?
Do you know if there's going to be a Spanish version?
That's actually something that I am talking to them about.
Okay.
I requested that they do that. And what they said was that we need to have, Nebraska needs to have requests from folks
People,
for that
yeah.
to be translated. So
Right.
I am pushing for that because I would really love that to happen.
Right.
So, and it's kind of out of my hands, except that if I can get some folks to sort of help me move that down the path, that would be great.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah.
Let's see. We were supposed to have a special guest on, but he's not here, so we're just going to plow forward.
Okay.
Let's see. So, are you, is there going to be anything about, you know, in terms of promoting the book, are you going to be doing anything? I mean, what other types of social media things have you been doing?
Well, I was one of the things we did was with the SABR women's baseball. We did. I did one with Anika, who also just published a book about the All-Americans. So we're doing. You know, I did that, and there are, as I said, we've got a couple of things in the works that I really can't announce right now, but they have the potential to be pretty exciting, and I will make sure everyone is aware of it. But, you know, right now we're trying to do things, interviews. I've done a number of podcasts. I've done, you know, Good Seats Still Available. I'm going to be doing There's No Crying in Baseball. I've done, you know, a number of podcasts that talk about the book. So those are the ways right now that we're trying to get it out. I'm hoping that at some point we'll be able to get back into either bookstores or some baseball, to a baseball field where we might do some book signings, something like that. But it's just so everything's up in the air right now.
Let's see. Marlene is throwing out here. Let's see. Can Kat talk about a call for papers for the upcoming IWBS Sabre Women in Baseball Conference? Oh, there you
Yes,
go.
I think I can.
All right, go ahead.
And in fact, that would be one of the places that I would like to see the book highlighted. SABR, for the second year in a row, is working with the International Women's Baseball Center to put on the Women in Baseball Conference. And we had planned for this to be the weekend of September the 11th through 13th, I think, and it was going to be hosted by Rockford University in Rockford, Illinois, where the IWBC is headquartered. So with everything in the up in the air, we're not sure. There may have been a decision made this week, but we're not sure if it's going to be in person or virtual. But the call for papers is out there, and the focus right now is, because of course this is the 100th anniversary of the Negro Leagues. The focus right now is African American women in baseball, and so, but that doesn't mean if you have another topic on women in baseball that you should not submit a proposal. So I want to make that clear. The deadline is July 15th, unless that has been changed. And so we welcome all kinds of papers, anything that you would like to contribute. And, you know, Leslie is on, and Leslie is sort of chairing that Leslie is chairing that committee. And so if there are changes that I haven't announced, she might be able to give us those. But please, you know, put in a proposal. This is the second year we've done this, and I think it's going to be bigger and better. And it is an honor for the IWBC to work with SABR. And so we're hoping that this becomes an annual event that will be hosted in Rockford, Illinois. So
Gotcha.
that's the hope.
That's the plug. Let's see.
Yeah.
Hey, Kit, are you on? Mr. Kit Krieger. Let's see. Oh, can't do it. All right. So sorry about that. Let's see. So we're going to end our session here. We've been speaking with Dr. Kat Williams, author of Isabel Lefty Alvarez, The Improbable Life of a Cuban American Baseball Star, available now at dealers near you. You know, Kat, it's been great to have you with us. Really appreciate you sharing the life of Lefty. What an amazing life that she's led. And, you know, really look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
And everyone out there, please, thank you very much. Stay safe. You know, we're still trying to flatten that curve wherever you are. Looks like Perry's got a little kitty there. Hello, kitty. And everybody, you guys take care of yourself.
Thank you.
And I think look for new future announcements from SABR regarding the remote conference. And just so you know, I'm actually hosting a session on baseball arts. It is called Evaluating Baseball Arts, Visual Storytelling in a Digital Age. And I'll have 3 artists with us. And so you'll hear some announcements about that coming up within the next couple of weeks. So
that's fantastic.
SABR conference Stay at Home coming up soon. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you.
And yeah, again.
Thank you, everyone.
And happy Father's Day to you fathers out there. All right. Take care. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.